George Harrison was known as the quiet Beatle, the spiritual one, the peaceful one who found enlightenment through meditation and Eastern philosophy, the man who wrote songs about love and unity and finding inner peace. But there was one person George Harrison truly hated, one person who made his blood boil for over 30 years, one person he could never forgive no matter how much he meditated or how enlightened he became. And when you hear the name, you will gasp, because this person was supposed to be his brother, his bandmate, his friend, the person he spent more time with than almost anyone else on earth. Before we dive into video, please subscribe to our channel. Before you understand the hatred, you need to understand who George Harrison really was. Not the image everyone saw, not the legend, not the quiet Beatle who smiled politely in photographs. The real George, the complicated George, George who carried anger and resentment for decades while everyone assumed he was at peace with the world. George Harrison was born in Liverpool in 1943. His family was working class. His father drove a bus. His mother was a housewife. George was the youngest of 4 children. He was quiet and shy as a boy, not particularly good at school, but he was obsessed with music from a very early age. He got his first guitar when he was 13 years old. He taught himself how to play. He practiced for hours every single day. By the time he was 15, he was good enough to join a band called the Quarrymen. The band had been started by John Lennon. Paul McCartney had just joined. George was the youngest member, the baby of the group, the kid who had to prove himself to the older boys. The Quarrymen eventually became the Beatles. The Beatles became the biggest band in history. 4 boys from Liverpool who changed music forever and created something the world had never seen before. John Lennon was the leader and the rebel. Paul McCartney was the charmer and the perfectionist. Ringo Starr was the drummer and the peacemaker. George was the quiet one, the lead guitarist, the one who stayed in the background while John and Paul took all the spotlight. For years, George seemed happy with that role. He played guitar beautifully. He sang backup vocals. He wrote a song or 2 per album while John and Paul wrote everything else. He smiled in photographs. He did interviews where he made jokes and seemed relaxed. He seemed content to be the quiet Beatle who supported the others. But inside, something else was happening that nobody could see. Resentment was building year after year. Anger was growing stronger. Frustration was eating away at him like a disease, because George Harrison was not content at all. He was not happy. He was not at peace. He was furious. And all that fury was directed at one person, Paul McCartney, the person who treated him like a sideman instead of an equal, the person who controlled everything, the person who made George feel small for 15 years. The Beatles recorded their first album in 1963. It was called Please Please Me. The album had 14 songs on it. John Lennon wrote or co-wrote 9 of them. Paul McCartney wrote or co-wrote 9 of them. Some were collaborations between John and Paul. George Harrison wrote 0 songs, not a single one. The second album came out later that same year. It was called With the Beatles. 14 more songs. John and Paul dominated again. George got 1 song, just 1. And it was not even his own composition. It was a cover of Roll over Beethoven. This pattern continued for years and years, album after album. John and Paul wrote everything that mattered. George got 1 song per album if he was lucky, maybe 2 if the stars aligned. And even when he brought his own songs to the band, the others would dismiss them without really listening. In a 1977 interview, George talked about those early years with bitterness still in his voice. He said that every time he brought a song to the studio, Paul would find something wrong with it. The melody was not strong enough. The lyrics needed work. The structure was confusing. Always something. Always a reason why George's song was not good enough to make the album. Meanwhile, Paul's songs were automatically accepted without question. John's songs were celebrated as genius, but George's songs had to fight for every second of recording time, every moment in the spotlight. George started to notice something else too, something that made the anger worse. When he did manage to get a song on an album, Paul would take over the arrangement. Paul would tell George how to play his own song. Paul would suggest changes that made it sound more like a Paul McCartney song than a George Harrison song. The song would stop being George's vision and become Paul's version of what George's song should be. In the recording of a song called Not Guilty in 1968, the band did over 100 takes, more than 100 attempts at the same song, because Paul kept saying it was not right, kept demanding changes, kept controlling every single aspect of the recording. The song never even made it onto the White Album after all that work, all those hours wasted, all that effort for nothing. George began to realize something painful during those sessions. Paul McCartney did not see him as an equal, did not see him as a real songwriter. Paul saw him as the guitar player, the sideman, the employee who should be grateful for whatever scraps John and Paul threw his way. That realization created a hatred that would last the rest of George's life, a hatred that would survive the breakup of the Beatles, a hatred that would survive decades of separation, a hatred that would survive even George's own spiritual journey toward peace and enlightenment. Some wounds are too deep to heal. Some betrayals are too fundamental to forgive. For George Harrison, Paul McCartney represented both. The breaking point came in January 1969. The Beatles were recording what would eventually become the Let It Be album. The sessions were a complete disaster. The band was falling apart. Everyone was angry and exhausted and sick of each other. The magic was gone. Only tension remained. On January 6th, George brought a song to the session. It was called I Me Mine, a song about ego, about how obsession with self destroys everything. The irony of what happened next was not lost on anyone. Paul immediately started criticizing the song. The tempo was wrong. The chord progression was too simple, it needed a bridge section. On and on he went with criticisms and suggestions. George tried to defend his song. He said, "This is how I wrote it, Paul. This is how it is supposed to sound. This is my vision." Paul would not let it go. He kept pushing. He said, "George, I am trying to help you. I am trying to make it better. I am trying to make it work." George's voice got louder. "You are trying to control it," he said, "like you control everything else." Paul looked genuinely shocked. "What are you talking about?" he asked. George exploded. "Everything," he said. "Every song I write you have to change. Every idea I have you have to improve. Every decision we make you have to be in charge. I am sick of it, Paul. I am sick of you treating me like I am not good enough." Paul got defensive immediately. "That is not true," he said. "I am just trying to make the music as good as it can be. I am trying to help." "No," George said. "You are trying to make everything sound like you want it. You cannot stand when someone else has a vision. You have to control it all. You have to be the boss of everything." The argument escalated quickly. John Lennon and Ringo Starr watched in uncomfortable silence. Paul and George yelled at each other. Things that had been building for years came pouring out like poison. Resentments from a decade of working together. Finally, George had enough. He stood up from his chair. He put down his guitar carefully, and he said the words that shocked everyone in the room. "I am done," he said. "I am leaving the band. Find another guitarist because I quit." He walked out of the studio, left the building, went home to his wife. The Beatles had broken up, at least temporarily. George came back a few days later after the others begged him. They convinced him to return. They promised things would be different. They promised he would get more respect, more input, more control over his own songs and his own sound. It was a lie. Nothing changed at all. And George never forgave Paul for that broken promise. The Let It Be sessions were filmed. Hours and hours of footage captured everything. In 2021, that footage was turned into a documentary called Get Back. People who watched it were shocked by what they saw. The tensions were obvious. The disrespect was clear. There is a moment in the documentary that shows everything you need to know. Paul is sitting at the piano working on a song. George is sitting nearby with his guitar. Paul is explaining how he wants the guitar part to sound. He is showing George exactly what to play, telling him the rhythm and the notes and the feel, treating George like a session musician instead of a creative equal. George sits there looking absolutely miserable. His face shows barely controlled anger. Finally, he speaks up. "Paul, I know how to play guitar," he says quietly. Paul does not seem to hear him. He just keeps explaining, keeps demonstrating on the piano, keeps controlling the creative process. George says it again louder. "I know how to play guitar, Paul. I have been playing guitar since I was 13 years old. I do not need you to show me how to play." Paul finally stops talking. He looks at George. There is tension in the air so thick you could cut it with a knife. Paul says he is just trying to help the song. George says he does not need that kind of help. They move on to something else, but the damage is done. You can see it in George's eyes in the footage. The resentment, the anger, the pure hatred. People who watched Get Back were genuinely surprised. They had always heard that the Beatles were like brothers, that they loved each other deeply, that the breakup was sad but amicable and friendly. The documentary showed the truth that had been hidden for decades. At least between Paul and George, there was real animosity, real tension, real hatred simmering under the surface. The Beatles officially broke up in 1970. George was finally free to make his own music without interference, free to write his own songs without criticism, free from Paul control and Paul criticism and Paul endless suggestions for improvement. He released an album called All Things Must Pass in November 1970. It was a triple album, 23 original songs, songs he had been writing for years while the Beatles only let him contribute 1 or 2 per album. Songs that Paul had rejected or ignored or tried to change into something else. The album was a massive success beyond anyone's expectations. It went to #1 on the charts. It sold millions of copies worldwide. Critics called it a masterpiece. Many said it was better than anything John or Paul had released solo. It was proof that George Harrison was a genius who had been held back by the Beatles, held back specifically by Paul McCartney. George should have been happy. He should have felt vindicated. He should have enjoyed his success. But he was not happy because Paul could not just let him have his moment of triumph. In an interview in 1971, Paul was asked about All Things Must Pass. He said it was good, but it was too long, too indulgent. He said it could have been a much better single album if George had edited himself better, if George had cut out the weaker songs. George read that interview. He was absolutely furious. Even now, Paul could not stop criticizing, could not stop trying to control, could not just say congratulations and move on, could not let George have success without adding his opinion. George gave his own interview a few weeks later. He said that Paul was jealous, that Paul could not handle anyone else being successful, that Paul needed to be the center of attention always and forever. The feud was now public. Everyone knew. The quiet Beatle was quiet no more. In 1971, Paul McCartney sued the other 3 Beatles in court. He wanted to officially dissolve the partnership. He wanted control of his own music and his own money. John and George and Ringo opposed the lawsuit. They thought it could be worked out privately without lawyers and courts. Paul went ahead anyway. The lawsuit was bitter and public and nasty. Everyone had to testify in court. Everyone had to air their grievances publicly. Years of resentment came pouring out in legal documents. George's testimony was brutal and honest. He talked about how Paul had controlled everything in the Beatles, how Paul had treated him like a sideman instead of an equal partner, how Paul's ego had destroyed the band. Paul's testimony was defensive. He said George was exaggerating everything, that he had always supported George's songs, that George was being ungrateful for everything the Beatles had given him. The judge ruled in Paul's favor. The Beatles were officially dissolved legally. But the relationships were destroyed emotionally. Whatever love had existed between Paul and George was completely gone, replaced by hatred and bitterness and anger that would never fully heal. For the next 20 years, George and Paul barely spoke to each other. They would see each other occasionally at industry events. They would be polite in public because cameras were watching. They would say nice things in interviews when journalists asked about each other, but privately they wanted nothing to do with each other. In 1980, John Lennon was murdered in New York City. The 3 remaining Beatles reunited for the funeral. George and Paul were civil to each other. They shook hands. They hugged briefly for the cameras, but there was no warmth, no real connection. No genuine affection. After the funeral, George told his close friends that being around Paul made his skin crawl, that he could not stand the way Paul acted, like they were still friends, like nothing bad had happened between them, like decades of control and criticism and ego could be forgotten just because John was dead. In the 1990s, the Beatles did the Anthology Project. It was documentaries and albums and interviews about their history. George participated in the project, but he made sure his interactions with Paul were absolutely minimal. They recorded in separate sessions whenever possible. When they had to be in the same room together, George was cold and distant. People who worked on Anthology said the tension between George and Paul was painfully obvious to everyone. They would disagree about everything, about which songs to include, about how to tell the Beatles' story, about who deserved credit for what achievements. One producer said George seemed to take genuine pleasure in contradicting Paul. Whatever Paul wanted, George opposed, not necessarily because he disagreed with the idea, but because he enjoyed frustrating Paul, enjoyed taking away his control, enjoyed finally having equal power after decades of being treated as inferior. George Harisson was diagnosed with throat cancer in 1997. It came from years of heavy smoking. He fought the disease for 4 long years. By 2001, it was clear to everyone that he was dying. The cancer had spread. There was no hope left. Paul reached out during this time. He wanted to visit. He wanted to make peace. He wanted to say goodbye properly before it was too late. George agreed to one final visit. According to people close to George, the visit did not go well at all. Paul came to George's home in Los Angeles. They sat together in the same room. They talked about old times, about Liverpool, about the early days. Paul cried. He said he loved George. He said he was sorry for anything he had done wrong over the years. He said he hoped they could make peace before the end came. George's response was cold and distant. He said he forgave Paul, but his tone suggested he did not mean it. He said they had good times and bad times. He said the Beatles were a long time ago, ancient history. He did not say he loved Paul back. He did not offer the warmth that Paul was clearly seeking. The visit lasted less than an hour. When Paul left, George told his wife Olivia that he was glad it was over, that seeing Paul had been harder than he expected, that some wounds never heal no matter how close death gets. George Harisson died on November 29, 2001. He was only 58 years old, far too young. Paul McCartney released a public statement saying he was devastated by the loss, that George was his baby brother, that he loved him deeply and would miss him forever. George's family read that statement, and some of them were quietly angry. Baby brother, one relative said to a reporter. Paul never treated George like a brother. He treated him like an employee, like hired help. And George never forgot that, not for a single day. Years after George died, more information came out slowly. Interviews he had given that were not published until later. Letters he had written to friends. Conversations people remembered. All of it confirmed the same thing. George Harisson truly hated Paul McCartney. Not hated in a casual way. Not the kind of hatred that fades with time. Hated in a deep personal way that never went away no matter how much time passed. He hated Paul for treating him as inferior for 15 years. He hated Paul for controlling his music and his creativity. He hated Paul for criticizing everything he did. He hated Paul for never seeing him as an equal partner. He hated Paul for being unable to apologize sincerely. He hated Paul for acting like they were friends when the friendship had died decades ago. And the saddest part of this entire story is that Paul probably never fully understood how much George hated him. Paul saw their relationship as complicated but ultimately loving. Two brothers who fought sometimes but cared about each other deep down. George saw it completely differently. He saw Paul as the person who held him back from his potential, who made him feel small and inadequate, who took the best years of his life and made him miserable while pretending it was for his own good, while pretending he was helping. The quiet Beatle was quiet about many things. He kept his pain private. He kept his struggles hidden. But his hatred for Paul McCartney burned hot and steady for over 30 years. From 1969 until the day he died in 2001, he found peace in meditation. He found wisdom in Indian spirituality. He found love in his family and his wife. But he never found forgiveness for Paul McCartney. That was the one thing his spiritual journey could not give him. That is the truth that makes people gasp when they hear it. Not that George Harrison hated someone. Everyone has people they dislike. But that he hated Paul McCartney, his bandmate for over a decade, his supposed brother, the person the world thought he loved and missed, the person everyone assumed he had made peace with. George Harrison truly hated Paul McCartney more than anyone else in the world, and he carried that hatred with him to his grave. The quiet Beatle stayed quiet about many things, but the hatred was always there, burning, waiting, never forgiven, never forgotten, never healed.